When we hear the word cult, we often think danger. Extreme cases initially come to mind. The one that makes the headlines, like the notorious Jonestown massacre of over 900 people in the 70s, and the Branch Davidian ranch apocalypse in Waco, Texas in the 90s. But these cases are rare. The greater danger with cults lies in their power to manipulate lives in an environment of thought reform and mind control. Today we're discussing the characteristics, prevalence, and danger of cults. If you have any questions, comments, or even experiences you'd like to share with us, give us a call at any time. Our lines are open. My guests today are Professor Lorne Dawson from the University of Waterloo. He works in the departments of sociology and religious studies. And Tony Costa is a cult expert and researcher. Tony and Lorne, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, it's good to be here.
Now, when one uses the word cult, again, as I mentioned in the introduction, we tend to think of the extreme cases. But is there an acceptable or perhaps an academic definition of the word cult? I'd like to hear both of your perspectives on this.
Well, it's one of those fuzzy concepts. There's no clear definition of it. It's like a word like intelligence or ghosts or something of this nature. We all have a good enough sense of what it means to be able to use the term, but there are wide disputes about it. And it's usually used in three different ways, roughly. Within a sort of religious context, often cult is a word that's used to identify a group that holds a view that's heretical, that's unorthodox, that somehow is opposed to the dominant religious position. Within organizations that are very concerned about cults and what academics call the anti-cult movement, it's used as a completely derogatory term to signify a group that engages in mind control or manipulation or harms people in some way. Academics try and avoid both those, most academics try and avoid both those definitions and come up with something more neutral. But then you get down into defining certain characteristics that are present in most groups called cults, but there are always dozens and dozens of exceptions. So we can talk about those characteristics, but I should let Tony.
Certainly, we could elaborate.
Yeah,
yes.
I would agree with Professor Lawson on this, definitely. There is a theological definition, there's sociological definitions, etc. But I think the key words here, what this all boils down to, is control and manipulation. A group that exerts control over its members, I think, is deemed by society to be counterproductive, both psychologically and sociologically.
Now, you mentioned the various types of definition falling perhaps under broader categories like the theological, the sociological. Why the difference here?
Well, Tony, for example, just gave a definition of cults that I wouldn't accept. He would give he gives them a definition of cults that is from the perspective of most sociologists engaged in the study of new religious movements. We identify that as being a position that is broadly identified with what we call the anti-cult movement. Now, we can get into debates about that, but basically it's the definition that's been formed by those who, for various reasons, have become personally and professionally very concerned about the presence of cults in society. So they've shaped a definition that doesn't act as a neutral descriptor of a social phenomenon, but is a sort of hammer to hit these organizations with. So the cult immediately conjures up these negative connotations. I'd want to be much more careful and come up with a definition that allows you to talk about a type of thing that exists in our society, which in some instances may display negative features that we need to be worried about and concerned about. But in many instances, I would actually say the majority of instances is free of those features. So I would use more descriptors like, all right, what kind of groups do I call cults? Well, pretty obvious things. Very new religions, right? Religions that involve some degree of innovation, that are breaking away from the mainstream religious traditions in some way. They tend overwhelmingly to be groups that are focused on some strong charismatic founding figure, some strong leader. That in itself automatically isn't necessarily dangerous, but it has potentials for danger. But of course, as I try and say to my students, throughout our society, corporations and the military and in education, we're always looking for charismatic people. We're drawn to charismatic people. All kinds of organizations wish to have charismatic figures present in them. They're also then offering usually some kind of esoteric teaching. What I mean by that is something that they see as being special, unique. elements of secretive, that it's unique, that only a certain elect few people have the right to know this knowledge or will be gain access to this knowledge. And then it's not just knowledge, there's almost always attached to some kind of new techniques, something new you can do to bring about change, betterment, improvement, or salvation in your life, usually in a really much more rapid way than conventional religions. So I don't see as an inherent part of the definition of cults anything about mind control or psychological manipulation. That is something that may happen and has to be empirically assessed in some groups under some circumstances, but is not a generic feature of the phenomenon itself.
But is there a solid general feature or a generic feature that you could identify? I mean, for those of the people listening, and they want to know, look, what is the strongest feature involved in under that umbrella of cults?
Right.
What would you say it is?
I'd say I'd combine the two things. The strongest feature is that it's going to be a charismatic figure who's offering some kind of new esoteric teaching, some teaching that they're saying is special, and only those who undergo special sort of training can gain access to or acquire or know this new teaching.
In terms of prevalence of cults in our society, particularly North American society, have the two of you seen trends toward perhaps a greater number or even lesser, as the case may be?
Well, I would say that I wouldn't say it's grown exponentially. I think there's been a steady growth in new movements, religious movements, etc., especially those that tend to be more of the apocalyptic stripe. So I would say that there has been a growth, but not an exponential growth, as some people would assume.
Okay, let's go now to Gord on line 4. Hello, Gord, you're on the line.
Hello.
Hi, Gord.
I would like to tell my experience with my granddaughter and a cult that she admits she belongs to.
Go ahead.
She was born a Roman Catholic, but when I was over at her house one time, I noticed that she had 2 black cats, and they burn incense at their little meetings, or whatever you want to call these things, and she painted her fingernails black, toenails black. So I put it to her one time, Corey, what's going on? She said, well, the group that meets at her house have give up on God. They don't want anything to do with God, and they've played around with this cult business. Now, I told her, you'll answer to God when you die for this malarkey you're putting on. And she said, I don't give a damn.
Gord, thanks for sharing that experience. What can you tell us about this? I mean, what Gord describes here seems to be typical of a lot of the youth that you see today. And there is a name for this cult. One of you may remember what that is, but they paint their nails black. They usually wear a very light colored powder on their face. They dye their hair black. Yeah. They wear all black.
Well, it could be that she's a goth.
Or goths, yes.
But it could be also that she's involved in some aspect of a neo-pagan practice as well. It's hard to say. Obviously, we don't have much information to go on from Gord's comments. The thing that you always have to keep in mind and be careful about, and we also don't know how old, I think you said this was his granddaughter?
Yes, the granddaughter.
Don't know how old she is. I mean, let's take the worst case scenario that Gord probably would be frightened of, is that his daughter is involved in a satanic group. I mean, it immediately causes us all to conjure up extremely, worrisome images.
Yes.
But we have to recognize that there's been a lot of studies, careful studies of these groups, and overwhelming majority, like his daughter, are what would be called adolescent dabblers. I mean, basically what we're dealing with is adolescent rebellion, right? Teenage rebellion. Same rebellion that produced, leather coats and motorcycles and chains around people's necks in the past. It's just, of course, as our society becomes more extreme in its activities, the media present, the form of rebellion becomes more extreme too. And in those cases, I mean, adolescent dabbling in these things is usually just that. It's a phase. It's something someone's going through for a time. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be concerned, but it's important not to overreact, too.
I would agree with Professor Dawson on this. I could be an adolescent stage, just a phase that she's going through right now. And there's many young people her age who go through this phase, and some of them are fans of Marilyn Manson, for example,
Yes,
who also
yes.
dons the same look,
Cultivates it.
etc. And there are, yes, neo-pagan groups like this, some Satanist groups identify themselves with darkness, etc. So I think it could be a phase that she's going through. And it doesn't mean we should ignore it, but certainly be careful not to jump the gun.
Let's go now to Sabrina on line 4. Hello, Sabrina. You're on the line.
My name, Sabrina. I consider Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult because they try to control your mind.
Sabrina, thanks for calling in. We're going to address that after this break. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion today on cults. Now, it was presented by our caller about Jehovah's Witness. What do you have to say about this, Tony?
Well, first of all, from a theological point of view, we were discussing earlier that there is a theological definition as well. The movement known as Jehovah's Witnesses, or officially the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, are considered by mainstream Christianity to be outside the parameters of Orthodox Christianity, and in that respect, they would be called a theological cult. They deny basic tenets of the Christian faith, such as the Trinity, deity of Christ, these type of things that mainstream Christianity holds dear and central. The other thing I would say is that I know many ex-members of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I have studied the group extensively, and there does seem to be elements of control within the group. There is a commitment to a governing body, which is considered to be the direct medium to God. Criticism of this authority can lead to disfellowshipping, excommunication. Ex-members are shunned. You are advised not to have any contact with any ex-members. And furthermore, you're also not allowed to read any material that is critical of the organization. So there are elements of control within this group.
I'll be curious what you'll have to say, because I mean, right now we're talking about religious cults, and as we were saying during the break, there are many types of cults, not necessarily religious. But I want to focus for a bit on religious cults. Now, I mentioned in the introduction about the whole Jonestown massacre. I found it very interesting when we looked at the founder of this organization, that he actually started out with mainstream Christianity, the Methodist Church,
right.
And certain things within the realms of Christianity upset him. He was a champion of causes, the poor, blacks who at the time in society were really put down, and he deviated from the mainstream Christianity or the Christian church because of this, and ended up founding his own branch of Christianity, and more he deviated as he went along. What I wondered from your investigations of these religious cults, do they mostly start out under the mainstream, but somehow they begin to drift more and more, or is it just somehow a diabolical invention of a religion right from the outset?
Actually, I mean, in a way, it's the reverse. We're going to have this sort of perspectival difference, but from a sociological perspective, when organizations start in the mainstream and drift away from it, they're not even technically cults. They're what are called sectarian groups. So the Jehovah's Witness, for example, would be an example of really what we'd call a sect, a religious sect, which is slightly different. There are different criteria applied than to a cult per se. And Jim Jones, in a sense, is an ambiguous case because he definitely, in the end, we have a very unpleasant situation. There are cult-like features to the organization, but for most of its history, it operated like a conventional Christian sect. And as you say, Jim Jones got into trouble for such notorious things when he founded his church originally in Indianapolis for introducing blacks to his congregation and daring to have blacks and white operate on an equal basis in the congregation. Now, most of us would say, well, that's a very Christian perspective he was adopting. His church that rejected him, compelled him to leave as minister of that church, were the ones behaving in an unchristian manner. So these are the typical kind of perplexities we get into. There's always drifts and changes. This is dangerous on this program in brief form saying this, but realistically it's the case. From an outsider's perspective, if you examine it, Christianity itself started as a cult. Christianity, not in the sense that Tony's been defining it, but in a historical sociological sense, it did. If you were a Roman in the 1st century AD, you would have this notion of this small, strange little man from a backwater of the Roman Empire who gathered 12 disciples around him and espoused these strange doctrines, and all these miracles he supposedly performed, and he rose from the dead. Can you believe that, right? And so it would seem very, far-fetched, strange, unusual, insignificant. And we've got to remember that for 100 years after Jesus died, there were about 10,000 Christians in the world, about the same size as many of the what we would call larger cults in operation today. Now, of course, 200 years after that, there were 245 million Christians in the world. Now, all these groups undergo change. Part of it is just as a group is successful and grows, well, you know what? Surprisingly, it's no longer a cult. Now, all of a sudden, as it grows, as it achieves legitimacy, as it becomes an ordinary part of life in a society, even though many of the doctrines may have never changed, all of a sudden now it's no longer a cult. Now it has a different definition or sign. Groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, etc., are all tracking on this path.
Tony, do you have anything to say about this?
I would say as well that one of the jokes that I remember my university professor telling me was that religions basically were the cults that won out, and the other ones just died out. And that's a sociological phenomenon. Indeed, Christianity began as a sect of Judaism. It considered itself Jewish, but it was removed from the mainstream Judaism of the time. If you could even speak of Judaisms, it was more like Judaisms. But I think what we have here with Jim Jones, and you're precisely right, it started off as a bona fide Christian group here, perhaps sectarian, but what we noticed when we look at Jim Jones and his history is that there was a downslide that took place.
And I think that's crucial, the downslide that took place
it's very, very crucial, because he started making claims for himself. He equated himself with Jesus Christ himself and asked for people's utter allegiance, even to the point where he asked for a mass suicide, if you remember, in Jonestown with the cyanide, etc. Of course, I would say that this is a very different concept than the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I don't think many did die for Jesus as martyrs. Many did go to their graves confessing him as Savior and Lord. But where I think Jim Jones differs is that there's a charismatic leader here who called for utter obedience to the point of controlling his members, manipulating his members to have sex with him, to basically just submit everything to him. And this is that slippery slope I'm talking about. It's that controlling tendency. The abusive aspect is when you begin to control people's minds. And that, I believe, is the danger.
But is abuse not key here when we're looking at that whole word and the examination of cult?
Well, that's exactly, sociologists have nothing wrong with saying that there have been very many dangerous cults in various ways. But again, what I would stress is what we need to do is identify the abuse and treat the abuse, not generalize abuse to cults. In other words, you don't need special mechanisms for understanding what's happening here. These are just organizations that start to become malfunctional, right? They start to dysfunction in various ways. And you can identify the ways in which they dysfunction in the standard ways you would in a business that starts to fail or collapse in some way, or a business leader who starts to embezzle or starts to become excessively preoccupied with his, I won't mention, there's a certain Canadian businessman that receives a lot of attention lately who we might say the popular impression is that he allowed his standing or his position to go to his head, right? And then engage in foolish judgments and foolish activities. This is the same kind of thing that happens in a religious context. I just want to stress that, the vast majority, we're talking about Jonestown, these are the extreme instances. We're talking about 6, depending on how you want to count it, about 6 major incidents of extreme violence associated with significant new religious movements in the last 30 years, out of thousands, and if we're talking worldwide, literally tens of thousands of new religious movements. So it's a tiny fraction of the groups. Now, those groups that have become violent, like Jonestown, have been studied in exhaustive detail, and we have a pretty good idea of what exactly went wrong and of the common forces across these groups that went wrong. But it's complicated, right? It's not, there's not a simple answer.
We've seen in the media certain cases of religions that are they deviate from the mainstream. And I'm not going to mention them by name, obviously, but we look at the stars, the movie stars, and many of them seem to be finding themselves through these strange brands of religion,
Right.
which somehow mix many branches together, the Eastern, the Christian, all of them put together.
Right.
And in whatever form they see, led by whoever they choose to worship. Now, I'm curious about these groups and what the attraction is, because somehow it seems to be spreading. But this branch of religion, I want to look at after this break. Today we're talking about cults. We'll be back after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion today about cults. Let's go now to Victoria on line 7. Hello, Victoria, you're on the line.
Hi.
Go ahead, Victoria.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks.
I was actually wondering how Christians view Mormons.
Yes, how do Christians view Mormons? Quite the political question.
Well, okay. Well, again, from the theological point of view, Mormonism has really never been admitted into the fold of historic Christianity. And in fact, the World Council of Churches has never admitted them, because one of the requirements for the World Council of Churches is to admit that Jesus Christ is God and Savior. Mormonism historically denies the classical doctrine of the Trinity. They teach that there are many gods. They teach exaltation. Man can become a god. And they also hold to the Book of Mormon and various other documents. So from a theological perspective, Christians have viewed Mormons as outside that parameter. They don't accept the claims of Joseph Smith, the prophet of Mormonism, etc., etc. So they see there's major theological differences between what we call historic mainstream Christianity and the claims of Mormonism.
Sociologically, though, the Mormon Church is really fascinating because, I mean, just have to say something relatively quickly here, but just to go for the obvious point, think about it. In early 1830s, Joseph Smith founds this church with, I think there are 5 original witnesses to his message, right? So 5 men in 1832, as I believe is the founding date of it. There are now 14 million Mormons in the world. Right? That is an incredible rate of growth, as I tried to indicate earlier, even for Christianity. That's an incredible rate of growth. You are compelled to say that there has to be something there, sociologically. There is some kind of substance, there's something that's appealing, there's something that's working, that's addressing the needs of a segment of the modern world and across the world. There are 10 million within the United States alone. So, you know, so it's one thing to say they are not conventional Christianity. On the other hand, they are something that needs to be understood.
I want to expand for a moment on this notion that you just mentioned there, the needs of the modern world. Now, of course, we're talking about North America here. This is our culture. And this pretty much takes us back to what we were discussing before the break on these numerous religions that have somehow sprung up and the stars are following them.
Right.
When we look at needs of the modern world, it seems like we're the information age. We've had that explosion of the information age. We're no longer, by and large, a society of hunter-gatherers and farms anymore. Yes,
Right.
there are farmers out there for sure.
Yeah.
And we're not undermining this, but we're the information age. We're the me generation. So people are on this whole road of self-discovery. Me, who am I?
Right.
Where can I find an experience? And that more than others seems to govern, at least from what I'm observing, and I want to hear your points of view on it, this whole need of our generation to experience something. Whether you're a Christian, whether you're some other religion, you want to experience. And the media, the movies have gotten a hold of this. Hence, we've gotten more graphic, more detailed, in some ways that perhaps are to our demise. How do you address the needs of modern man?
Yeah, and there are
and
a lot,
women.
Yeah, a lot of studies. I mean, you've hit all on the sort of right elements, because there's a lot of studies now. I mean, of the contemporary American population, Canadian population to a degree, and Western European population too, showing exactly the things you said. What do people want in religions nowadays? Well, you know, there's a long list, but primarily they want a religion that's focused on their individual development. They want a religion that somehow is an individual inner experience. They see the sacred as coming from within, not something that's given to them from without. They want experience. They don't want to just sit through rituals and activities and be promised some kind of fulfillment at a later date. They want their lives to be changed, transformed now. Now that can take the form of Kabbalistic mysticism like Madonna is engaged in,
Yes.
or Pentecostalism. I mean, in other words, there's a great variety of ways in which that need for experience can be satisfied, but it is vibrant experience that people want, right?
Yes.
They also, curiously combine with that, a very pragmatic approach to things. People now are saying what they want out of religious leaders is people who can provide the experience, who can provide immediate leadership, who seem to lead by example, not by because they're ordained, because they have some kind of credentials, because they've been assigned to some sort of role of leadership. They want you to practically demonstrate your leadership. And then the other thing they want is some kind of looser organizational structure, because our lives are becoming so complex, so many demands, so much need for flexibility. People want forms of religion that they can satisfy their needs when they can manage to do it in their modern busy schedules.
Now, I want to hear what you think of this next question, Tony, of people's need to experience. Could that not open the door to perhaps more cult activity, for people to be more attracted to cults that may perhaps provide that experience they're looking for?
Well, definitely. I think that the existential quest has always been there. Humans are curious by nature. We want to know basically the big three questions of life. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? These are questions that philosophers and theologians have been asking for centuries, for perhaps millennia. And I think that the issue behind all this is the quest. Every human being needs to affirm their existence, somehow find meaning in life, and they may look to religion, they may look to philosophy, they may look to whatever is out there. But there are cases where I think, for example, at the university setting where I work and study, in the universities, of course, there are certain groups within the campus who prey on young students, for example, who are new to the country, who maybe experience homesickness, whatever it may be, and these people are prime targets for certain groups that would like to take these people, make them part of their membership, and then what we hear, and we hear this at the University of Toronto where I work, we hear of stories of people being controlled, manipulated, coerced, these types of things. So the quest is valid, the quest is real, the desire and thirst is there. But the question is, what are you getting yourself into? I'm not against religion at all. I think it's a healthy expression of our self-identity. But there are certain groups out there that will prey on people who really want to know, or really want to have meaning in their life.
But let's go into the ambiguity of how would you know if we take some of the callers talking about their relatives or something that have become involved in a group, and I get phone calls like this in my office, several times a year too. And anyone who's going to be involved in a new religion, a new quest, if they're taking the spiritual quest seriously, is going to get very enthusiastic about it, is going to, these are important issues. We see them as important issues. We see it as virtuous in other contexts if people dedicate their lives for a period of time to accomplishing something. Well, if you're thinking about gaining an experience that is going to transform your life and maybe give you finally a sense of security and peace, or a sense that you're saved, or whatever the language may be, little wonder people become, fully engaged and accept authority of certain religious leaders in the process of doing this. And they're probably, like people who've just quit smoking, going to be a little, over the top in promoting their attitude to other people and things of this nature. When do you know that it's crossed over from just healthy enthusiasm about something that may seem a little unusual to you, but if we put it in historical perspective, it's just one of thousands of these kinds of beliefs that have come along the lines, or something that is potentially dangerous? I keep being worried by Tony's language in discussing this, because overwhelmingly, the evidence is that most cults are not dangerous, are not controlling. But if you keep creating that impression, you create a culture of fear in society that does damage to religious development, religious freedom, to these groups. Many of these groups, you never think of putting it from their perspective. Many of these groups who are quite legitimately pursuing a spiritual quest suffer enormous public persecution because of simple lack of understanding.
Professor Dawson, though, people have to be really careful, because there are those groups out there that really do manipulate members. They go so far as to be almost underground. They evade taxes. They pressure the group. They put them under virtual psychological problems here. The members become anxious. They become basically so devoted that most of their funds end up going to these groups.
Well,
they're mismanaged. They elicit sexual
where,
activity
that's
happens.
right.
But we're going to have to go for the break. But I have a list here. I'll be curious on what the two of you have to say about this list. This is actually a checklist, giving people an idea of what to watch out for if perhaps a loved one does become involved. But we're going to go for a break now. Today we're talking about cults. We're going to return after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our conversation today about cults. Let's go now to Matthew on line 1. Hello, Matthew, you're on the line.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. My name is Matthew, and I would just like to respond to one of your guests. I don't know his name, the gentleman in a light blue shirt and suit. He alleged that Christianity might be thought of as starting as a cult at its beginning, and I completely disagree with him because that is totally false. And the reason I believe that is because many members of the Jewish leaders of the Jewish religious faith at that time switched to Christianity, such as Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, St. Paul, who was Saul, and these were leaders and Pharisees in the Jewish establishment. And plus, there were thousands of other Jewish people who converted to Christianity en masse at that time.
Yes. Response to that, Professor
Well,
Lawson.
you've got to remember, I'm talking sociologically and how things would appear sociologically, and obviously much could be said once again. Let's use another example, though, maybe. We could go to a group like Christian Science, which Tony would acknowledge that in the sort of classic theological approach to these issues, Christian Science is usually lumped with the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult from a mainstream Christian perspective. For certain groups, certainly evangelical Christians look at them that way. But in fact, at one time, Christian Science, to use, I'm building on your example, some of the most powerful and important people, high percentage of the people in the Congress of the United States, a high percentage of the people in the executive of the government of the United States were Christian Scientists, right? The Christian Science newspaper was the most respected newspaper of its day for the longest period of time. There was concern by certain people at a certain time that Christian Science was too much into the sort of powers of the land. So there's a case of a group that started as a cult. They would be sociologically seen as a cult, theologically seen as a cult, evolved into something else. I would now say they were a sectarian group or even a denomination of the Christian church from a sociological perspective. And like your example of Christianity, they drew onto themselves very powerful people in the American culture from mainstream Christianity. So I'm just sort of saying the issue isn't as clear as you think it is using the material that you used.
And once again, you're coming from strictly from a
sociological
perspective. Now, I have a list here, and I'd like to hear both of your thoughts on this briefly. This is the list given to, in other words, beware that it could be a cult. Again, the saying goes, if it looks like a duck, it is a duck, whatever that goes. Focused on a living leader. Now, this is something that you indicated earlier, okay? Preoccupied with bringing in new members, preoccupied with making money, questioning, doubt, and dissent are discouraged or even punished. Mind-numbing techniques like meditation, chanting. The leadership dictates sometimes in great detail how members should think, how they should act, how they should even feel. And sometimes members have to get permission on who they should marry, if they should change jobs. They even ask questions about dates. The group is polarized. This is another angle here. They create a we versus them mentality. The group leader is not accountable to any authorities. The group teaches that the end justifies the means. The leadership induces guilt feelings in members in order to control them. And members' subservience to the group causes them to cut ties with family, with friends, and basically to give up any personal goals and activities that were of interest to that person before they joined the group. Members are expected to devote inordinate amounts of time to the group, and members are encouraged or required to live in and or socialize only with members of that group. I'd like to hear your thoughts on these basic warning signs of a cult.
Well, I have counseled many of these people and ex-members of some groups that are suspect, and they all share these symptoms. The lack of integrity, feeling less than, not questioning the leader, basically disfellowshipped or excommunicated if you disagree with the authority that is in the group. Many of the people I've counseled, some of them went even as far as trying to commit suicide because they felt that there was nothing outside the group, there was no truth out there, all there was damnation, or they would go to hell, or they'd be satanically possessed of something of that nature. So from an experiential perspective, I have dealt with people who have come out of certain groups, and they do display those symptoms, and they do confirm the points that you've just enumerated.
Yeah, see, I would say that I know the organization this list comes from. It's a grab bag of principles, mainly negative principles, but some of them are neutral. Some, I would say, apply to cults, some don't. And the problem is, as I say, we're going back to, is the word cult a description of something like cup, or is it a word that automatically classifies any organization as being antisocial, harmful in some way, and harmful maybe through manipulation? We can choose to say, well, that's how we're going to define it, but then the word has lost all utility for describing, I would say empirically, the vast majority of the groups that we think we want to apply the name to. So you can say, fine, we'll use it in this highly negative sense. Now we need to come up with another term that's going to be acceptable by everyone to describe all these other groups that may be operating in society. Now, we've got to deal with, there's certain facts that Tony's working from his experience counseling people and talking to people. I'm a sociologist. I'm a little concerned that that's anecdotal, that this is, a few instances of something that you happen to be exposed to for certain reasons. So if we go to statistical studies that have been done, and we're not talking minor studies, we could go to something like Eileen Barker's 10-year-long study of everyone involved in the Unification Church, the Moonies, in England, right? These studies demonstrate that 90% of the people that join these organizations leave voluntarily, all right, of their own accord in less than 2 years. That doesn't suggest they're overly manipulative. There are other studies that indicate that upwards of 63% of the people who have been involved and leave voluntarily from these organizations say they basically have positive feelings about it. That it turned out not to be for them, but they still have good friends in the organization, that it was a worthwhile experience at that time in their life. What these things seem to be saying is we have to recognize that most people entering most cults are going through a phase in their lives where they're looking for something, they're questing, they're experimenting with lifestyle, with new religious ideas, things of this nature. That doesn't mean that there aren't instances where things go south, where things get very problematic, but we need to explain how those groups arise, not assume all groups become negative and manipulative, but to understand when are the instances that a group goes from being enthusiastic to overly dominating and totalistic in a person's life.
Now you mentioned about the word cult losing its utility, and I'm wondering if that's precisely not what's happening over time. Because when you look at our generation, let's face it, we've now become virtually survival of the fittest society. As society progresses, or some would argue goes in reverse, and we're losing certain vital traditions here, we've come to a place where almost anything goes. I mean, we've held shows here about perhaps censorship in the media. Some believe it shouldn't be censored, that we should just allow freedom of everything. I mean, we've addressed issues like even child porn, artistic merit, the whole shenanigan here. Now, my question is, as society progresses along the lines of anything goes, will we virtually lose the definition of cult since anything goes?
I think so. I mean, if we take the postmodern approach where everything is simply relative, truth is relative, well, then it really doesn't matter because truth is what you make it. Truth becomes what you want it to be.
And we're going to have to go for a break on that note. We'll be back after this. Stay tuned. Hello again, and welcome back to our discussion today about cults. Now, Professor Dawson, you wanted to say something concerning our last point.
Yeah, just, I mean,
society.
I agree with what Tony's saying, and I think many of us are personally concerned, I am, and otherwise, we're concerned about the great liberalism in our society, excessive liberalism. I guess what I want to say there is that it's all a matter of what criteria are going to be used to bring some kind of control into society. And I think most sociologists are more exercised and concerned about principles of religious freedom ensconced in various constitutions and things of that nature. It's all a matter of balance. We at this stage are more worried about people's freedom and right to express themselves being artificially restricted and controlled, as it has been in our human history. This freedom is very fragile. We've only had religious freedom in a society like Canada, the United States, or Europe for the last couple of hundred years, through thousands of years where people were compelled by the state to hold certain beliefs. So I agree with you. We've got a problem that you don't want to let anything go and no holds barred kind of thing. That is disastrous. On the other hand, what criteria do you use to determine what is a viable and what isn't a viable religious expression?
Okay, let's go now to Carolyn, line 8. Hello, Carolyn, you're on the line.
Hi. I'm just wondering, Tony mentioned that he also does counseling, because I have a sister, and she started off doing some volunteer work, and it ended up that she'd been doing it for a couple of years, and she ended up moving in with this woman, and she calls her mom. So we don't know, like, if that's what it is, or so I'm just wondering if Tony has an email or a telephone number or something like that.
Tony, do you want to give that quickly?
Yes, I'll give you my email. It's tmcos@rogers.com. tmcos@rogers.com.
Okay, thanks for calling in, Carolyn. Let's go now to Vic on line 7. Hello, Vic, you're on the line.
Hi, I'd just like to challenge your guys' concept of what a cult is. Because, do you not see a similarity in mainstream religious beliefs such as Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, similarity between that and cults for two reasons. First of all, the fear tactics, namely the hell doctrine and just basically punishment with fire for all people who are unbelievers. And the other reason I believe they share similarities is because of the promises of heavenly salvation, which basically asks for blind, non-questioning faith and blocks all healthy skepticism and questioning.
I would say it blocks all questioning, though. Okay, we're going to have to stop. Can you answer to that quickly?
Well, if I can quickly...
Because no religion will block questioning.
No, if I can quickly respond. There was a author many years ago, Ronald Enroth, who wrote a book, Churches That Abuse. And abuse is not just something that is germane to these fringe groups. I mean, there are churches that abuse. There are synagogues that abuse. There are mosques that abuse. And my concern is not so much the religious conviction of, say, Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or Hinduism. My concern here is if there's something going on within this religious movement where people are being manipulated, where they're being controlled against their will, I think that's a red flag. That's something we got to look out for, and something that we have to call attention to.
You have to recognize, though, we always have things like if you're operating within a normative Hindu tradition, one of the most sort of ancient elements of Hinduism is guru worship and the guru. This is not, and so from a Western perspective, with our values of individualism and liberty and freedom, it's unusual to see someone totally submit themselves to the will of the guru. But for thousands of years, Hinduism has taught that enlightenment can only come by complete surrender of the self to the wisdom of the guru, who is already an enlightened being. Now, we can say, well, that's a terrible scenario, but you have to recognize that's an ethnocentric judgment, right? That you are judging from a modern, Western, or even a quasi-Christian perspective, another tradition. This same kind of thing happens all the time in trying to judge new religious movements.
Should people not, though, be wary of a religion where if a person has questions, they seem to just shun them away and get angry with them even asking questions? To me, this is a really solid point. You're not going to go in there and try to change an entire religious doctrine. That's not what I mean. But if somebody goes in with valid questions and they want to know, and that religion is somehow trying to stifle that interest, is that not a warning to look out for?
Yeah, I think it is to a degree. This gets tricky, but this is what I say. I'd rather go back to sort of behavioral criteria or things that are happening. And I think this is, and it can be done, that you can look for some of those items off that list.
Thank you both so much for joining me today.